The British were working on something, although no one was quite sure what. Some kind of structure, perhaps a mobile structure, perhaps armed. Or maybe a new kind of static building, like a turret or fortification. As rumors of German spies and intelligence operatives became increasingly common, the British needed a way to disguise what it was they were building. They started referring to it as a water storage device, a water carrier, and eventually, tank. The name stuck. When these vehicles rolled onto the Western Front in 1916, the enemy saw that these tanks weren't water tanks at all, but a new kind of fighting machine. A realization of a vision Leonardo da Vinci had centuries before. A new age of mechanized warfare was beginning. But how effective were these new machines? What was the impact on the enemy? Join us as we explore the realities of tank warfare on the Western Front. From Flers-Courcelette to Cambrai to Amiens. While you're here with us, we'd like to invite you to explore our Ko-fi page. If you don't know what Ko-fi is, it's essentially Patreon without all the censorship and political baggage. Your support on Ko-fi directly fuels our ability to produce unique and exciting content that might otherwise remain hidden in the depths of the YouTube algorithm. In fact, some of our existing videos, like the ones on the Chaco War, the Beagle conflict, and Maurice Cohen's incredible journey, haven't received the recognition we believe they truly deserve. But we're determined not to shy away from such important topics, even if they might not align with the algorithm's preferences for promotion. With your support on Ko-fi, we can give videos like these a second chance, ensuring that these valuable stories and insights reach a wider audience without any concerns about our profitability month by month. We also haven't forgotten to include some awesome weekly and monthly perks for our supporters, so make sure you check out the link below. The summer of 1916 had come and gone, and yet, with autumn fast approaching, British, Commonwealth, and French forces were still deadlocked against the German Empire on the Somme. Now, more than 10 weeks after that bloody first day that had swallowed up over 26,000 lives in just a few hours, the British commanders were planning a new offensive. There had been some successes for the Entente over an otherwise grim summer. Around the center of the battlefield, the German line had been pushed back, as much as 8 kilometers in some cases. But each meter of ground gained meant casualties the Entente could ill afford. So, at Flers-Courcelette on September 15th, the British and Commonwealth forces would try something a little different. The Entente forces employed 2 tactical and technological innovations at Flers-Courcelette. First, leaning on the barrage, in which infantry would advance tightly upon a creeping artillery barrage designed to shake the enemy from their positions. Previously, artillery barrages had shattered enemy positions, but these positions were manned and resupplied by the time the infantry reached them. The tight formation would enable positions to be taken and occupied immediately. Second, a horrifying new technology, the creaking, lumbering machine of war known as the Mark I tank. Crewed by 8 men decked out in medieval-style chainmail armor and helmets to protect them from shrapnel and stray bullets, these leviathans weighed in at 28.4 metric tons, with armor between 5.8 and 11.9 millimeters thick. 2 6-pounder Hotchkiss QF guns and 3 Hotchkiss machine guns meant the Mark I could do more than absorb fire. It could shoot back too. Even at top speed, the Mark I traveled essentially at a walking pace, making it the perfect accompaniment to the slow infantry advance behind the screen of the barrage. Unlike the infantry on foot, however, the Mark I could break down at any time. To the men secreted within the great hull, every lurch forward would have been met with anxiety and trepidation, as the crew wondered if this would be the moment their machine gave up on them. The Germans had never seen anything quite like this before. The development of the Mark I had been top secret, and watching these metal monsters lumbering out of the smoke and debris like miniature castles mounted on caterpillar tracks put the fear of God into the defenders. Some even surrendered at the first sight of these beasts, as they advanced over barbed wire and trenches with bullets bouncing off them. Tactically, the tanks were a limited success. The 4th Army had 49 tanks, but not all of these would be used. 7 accompanied the Canadian troops on their advance. 3 were assigned to attack the German position known as Quadrilateral, southwest of Martinpuich, while 9 of the beasts advanced with the Guards Division toward Morval and Lebu to the northeast. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette was a qualified success. By September 22nd, the lines had moved beyond both Flers and Courcelette, pushing the Germans further back, but they did not reach Morval and Lebu. The Mark I had only a limited impact on the advance. In fact, by September 16th, only 3 of the steel beasts remained operational. However, one thing was certain: the tank had arrived and warfare was about to change forever. As December began, the British troops on the Borloo Ridge understood they were in trouble. What had been an important salient in the German line was rapidly turning into a death trap as artillery smashed into the positions on the higher ground and the German counterattack began in earnest. With enemy divisions now advancing across all other sections of the line, the British risked being completely cut off. When German troops took the Bonnever Ridge to the south, the situation went from bad to worse for the British, and a partial retreat began on the 3rd. By the 7th, almost all of the Entente gains around Cambrai had been reversed. The British still held Avrincourt, Ribecourt, and Fliquier along the Hindenburg line, representing a small victory. But the Germans had taken territory at Gonelio further south along the line. Once again, on the Western Front, a costly but optimistic advance had given way to bloody, senseless slaughter and a tactical stalemate. The Battle of Cambrai would have little to no impact on the outcome of hostilities along the front. The Entente would need to find another way through as the war entered its 4th year. The timeline of the Western Front is dotted with many battles like this one. And yet, the Battle of Cambrai is often mentioned in the same breath as more monumental struggles, like those at the Somme, Ypres, Arras, or Verdun, in the list of definitive actions along the front. Why is this? To find out, we need to roll back the clock by 2 weeks and learn more about just why those British troops found themselves up on the Borloo Ridge in the first place. The fields of Flanders are characterized by swampy terrain with soft earth that bogged down infantry advances and swamped military vehicles. After 3 years of combat, this terrain had been churned up even more, becoming a hellish landscape of crater and mud. By now though, more than a year after Flers-Courcelette, the Entente had a new and far more formidable weapon, the Mark IV tank. This was a much tougher customer than the Mark I, with thicker armor, up to 12mm, and a shorter barreled version of the Hotchkiss QF gun. The Hotchkiss was now a 6-pounder rather than a quarter-pounder. There were also Lewis machine guns rather than the Hotchkiss and Vickers guns previously used. The machine was supposed to be safer for the crew inside too, thanks not only to the thicker armor but also to its design and layout. 2 rear track horns protected the fuel tank, preventing the potentially catastrophic fires that had made the Mark I vulnerable in some situations. The Mark IV was incredibly exciting for the British command and sent shockwaves of fear through German troops. At Messines Ridge in June of 1917, the vehicle had performed admirably, but in July and August, attempts to deploy them at the 3rd Battle of Ypres had proved disastrous due to the swampy terrain. The Mark IV would not be an antidote to the quagmires of Flanders. British generals needed a new location to show what their new toy could do. They chose Cambrai. The initial plan was put together by Lieutenant Colonel JFC Boney Fuller, whose idea to attack Saint-Quentin with tanks evolved into a strategy to assault Cambrai. At the same time, Brigadier General H.H. Tudor had his own plan, formulating an armoured raid on the German trenches with no preliminary bombardment. An audacious plan that would retain the element of surprise until the very last moment. elements of this strategy would also be used in the planning for Cambrai. In the end, the British wouldn't be able to take full advantage of this surprise. The German forces knew something was up, and they expected an attack on Avrincourt from an infantry force with tank support. There was also a preliminary barrage against the wishes of General Tudor. At around dawn, the 3rd and 4th Infantry Corps, along with 9 battalions of the Tank Corps, began their assault behind a creeping barrage. Compared to what had gone before, this was a massive tank force, 437 in total, of which 378 were fighting tanks. It looked as if everything was going well. Progress was being made right across the battlefield, with advance units now up to 8 kilometers beyond the Hindenburg line. The 12th Infantry Division reached Latu Wood on the right flank, digging in there, while the 20th reached Manière before the weight of a tank crushed the bridge there and halted the advance. The 6th Division, in the center of the field, moved beyond Ribecourt and Mâcon, but was pushed back from their next objective at Noyelles. But there was a problem: Fliquier. This had been the first objective for the 51st Highlanders, but the heavy defenses around the area made capture almost impossible. Using an unorthodox tank strategy, different to that of other battalions along the line, Major General George Harper found that his armor was being picked off as his men advanced. Around 40 of these vehicles were knocked out by artillery, and an experienced anti-tank brigade stationed at Fliquier wreaked havoc among the advancing Mark IVs. The actions at Fliquier have passed into the stuff of legend and mythology, giving rise to stories of a lone gunner taking out British tanks single-handedly around the village. The lone gunner is almost certainly a fiction born out of the fog of war, like the Angels of Mons or the White Stockings of Russian military urban legend from decades later. But the situation itself was very real. The British were now losing tanks, and the advance was sagging at Fliquier. As the advance units pushed a salient into the line at Bourlon, the British began to take stock of what they had achieved. In 6 hours, they'd pushed further beyond the German lines than in 3 months of fighting in Flanders, and they'd taken significantly fewer casualties. There were still huge numbers of dead and wounded, but the grim, drawn-out horror of Passchendaele, where major fighting had ceased less than 2 weeks before, was not repeated. The lopsided nature of the advance left the units at Bourlon exposed, and much of the swift advance was reversed. But the Tank Corps had shown just what it could do. If tanks had arrived at Flers-Courcelette, then they had really begun to prove themselves at Cambrai. Tanks were still new and frightening in 1917, but they weren't viewed in the way they had been the year before. As the lumbering beasts crawled out of the smoke, the Germans would have known exactly what they were, and their arrival would not have been a surprise. The machines were still terrifying, especially in their new and improved Mark IV iteration, but some sections of the German line understood just how to deal with these monsters. Around Fliquier, an anti-tank unit that had honed its skills against French hardware during the Nivelle offensive achieved real successes, and the German troops knew that these vehicles could be stopped with the right approaches. Artillery fire also proved highly effective. But we're forgetting 2 things here. One, the scale of the Tank Corps' involvement at Cambrai. The sight of hundreds of tanks advancing up and down the line must have struck terror into the hearts of the German defenders. 2, the initial successes. The might of the Mark IVs managed to punch an enormous hole into the German lines. Yes, reinforcements arrived to save the day for the Germans at Cambrai, and the battle resulted in something of a stalemate. But the sweeping speed of the Tank Corps' advance would have been sobering for the German command. Even in its final year, the outcome of the war was very much in the balance. The collapse of the Eastern Front following the Russian Revolution meant the Central Powers could focus more resources, chiefly German resources, on the Western Front. The entrance of the Americans to the war in 1917 had tipped the balance marginally in the Entente's favor, but a bolstered Germany found herself able to launch the massive and possibly decisive assault she really needed. The German Spring Offensive, also known as the Ludendorff Offensive, transformed the stalemate in the west, pushing the lines back by over 60 kilometers in some sectors. It was a huge victory and the biggest advance on the Western Front since 1914. But it was also extremely costly. The Germans were exhausted, shattered, with casualty figures reaching almost 690,000. And even after all that, they had failed to end the war. Once the German offensive ran out of steam in July 1918, it would take the Entente only 3 weeks to mount a counterattack of their own. The 100 Days Offensive began at Amiens on August 8th. The Germans had needed something decisive, and they'd failed to achieve it. Now, the Entente would have their turn. The biggest tank offensive the world had ever seen up to this point was about to begin. This time, there would be no preliminary bombardment. The Entente forces had moved into position in secret, and they would stay that way right up until 4:20 AM on August 8th, when the heavy artillery opened up. Morale was low in the German trenches after the disappointment of the Spring Offensive, and communication was lacking between their 3 lines of defense. As the bombardment came to a halt, the German troops would have had only a few minutes to contemplate what was now rolling toward them. A combined arms assault of around 600 tanks, thousands of infantry, and air support from planes overhead. The initial assault was carried out by 2 Australian divisions, 2 British, and 3 Canadian, and it progressed at a high speed. The Australians reached their first objectives just after 7 AM, and by 8:20 AM, both the Australians and the Canadians had breached the German lines. Armoured cars and cavalry brigades harried the German forces, who were now in chaos, while the recently formed Royal Air Force inflicted heavy casualties. By 11 AM, the line had moved back 3 miles. As German soldiers gave themselves up in their thousands, Entente troops found themselves accepting the surrender of officers and divisional staff who would normally have been nowhere near the front. The French troops on the right of the battlefield were also on the move now. They'd taken Morhaix at 9:30 AM and were now shelling the German positions beyond this point. By the end of the day, a 15-mile section of the German line south of the Somme had been obliterated. In the north, there were gains too, but these were a little more limited as the terrain made advances difficult. While the speed of the infantry advance actually meant that tanks could not always keep up, the Mark V's and other pieces of hardware under the Allied command were highly effective at Amiens. The reliability issues that had plagued earlier versions of the tank were largely ironed out on the Mark V, and the latest iterations were better equipped and more maneuverable than what had gone before. While many Mark V's were lost, a great number of them survived their actions almost unscathed. The Barhead Mark V, serving with the 27th Australian Infantry Battalion, was critical in taking the villages of Bayonville and Abonnier, even advancing to the Blue Line, the furthest point reached by the Entente on that opening day. On returning to the rallying point, Barhead was described as being in splendid condition. The medium A Whippet tank was also deployed, capable of reaching speeds of up to 13 km per hour. At this stage in the war, the Entente not only had better tanks, they had more of them. And they brought these vehicles to bear on the beleaguered Germans in a big way. Like at Cambrai, the appearance of these machines of war was probably not enough to terrify the Germans the way they had in 1916. However, the lightning, or at least much quicker than what had gone before, advance, the combined arms tactics, and the skill of the tank crews were all devastatingly effective at Amiens. The German defenders, already plumbing the depth of morale, would have been shattered by the sudden arrival of some 600 tanks, along with the infantry, planes, and armoured cars that came with them. August 8, 1918 was just the first day of the 100 Days Offensive, but in many ways, it was the beginning of the end. The bloody stalemate of trench warfare was giving way to something more mobile, more capable of ending resistance in a matter of weeks rather than years. Only 5 days later, a meeting of the top German military and political figures concluded that a victory for the Central Powers on the battlefield was almost impossible. For Germany's allies in Europe, the situation was even worse. Austria-Hungary had lost the Second Battle of the Piave to the Italians in June, and now announced they could not fight beyond the winter. Bulgaria would end their involvement in the war following the Vardar offensive in Macedonia in September. As Vardar was winding down, the last major offensive of the Western Front was kicking off at Meuse-Argonne. The following month, a revolution would tear through Germany. It was all over, and the armistice of November 11th would make it official. While we can't blame a single day for the collapse of Germany in World War I, the first day at Amiens certainly played a pivotal role. General Ludendorff would describe August 8, 1918 as the Black Day of the German army. The presence of all those tanks might not have ended the war, but it certainly hastened its conclusion. What would it have felt like to face down a tank on the Western Front in World War I? Almost certainly, it would have been terrifying. These were new machines. They were loud, massive. They were tough, repelling bullets and demolishing defensive structures. Men would scream in agony and fear as they were cut down in no man's land, but these lumbering monsters would roll on, cold and unfeeling. We can't overstate the psychological effect this must have had on the German troops, as well as the psychological boost it offered to Entente forces. But over time, countermeasures would have become more sophisticated and successful. There's an idea of the First World War as a time of rigid tactics and bloody-minded generals trying the same thing over and over again, but this wasn't the case. As we've seen at Flers-Courcelette during the Battle of Cambrai, the defenders were able to adapt. They'd battled French tanks during the Nivelle offensive, and they used what they'd learned against the British. As well as new and innovative tactics, the Germans had new and innovative technology too. The K round, an armor-tipped bullet fired from an ordinary infantryman's rifle or from a specially designed anti-tank machine gun, was developed in the hope of puncturing the protective shell around the tank. Then there was the T rifle, or the Mauser 13.1mm anti-tank rifle that appeared in 1918, looking something like an elephant gun and packing a real, armor-piercing punch at close range. The Minenwerfer anti-tank mortar also appeared in 1918 and wreaked havoc as its shells whizzed across the battlefield on a flatter trajectory than a typical mortar. This was an effective weapon, but a shortage of horses toward the end of the war made logistics difficult, and the crews were also vulnerable to machine gun fire. The 3.7cm TAK Rheinmetall specialized anti-tank artillery was designed to be an upgrade for the Minenwerfer with a lower profile than its predecessor. Around 600 were completed in 1918, but it's uncertain how many actually made it to the battlefield. With effective countermeasures in place, it became clear that those early tanks were not invulnerable, impervious leviathans. They might have looked unbeatable, but this wasn't the case. Mechanically unreliable and slow-moving, with dire conditions for the crew inside, exposed to heavy artillery and air attacks, these vehicles could be knocked out of action, and often they were. By the time the war was over in 1918, tanks had been in the line for 2 years. There had already been huge advancements in technology, with the Mark I evolving into the far more sophisticated Mark V. There was certainly a long way to go. The tanks that swept across Europe in the Blitzkrieg of 1939 were light years ahead of these ones, but warfare had changed and it was never going to be the same. But what do you think? What was it like crewing one of these monsters or facing one on the battlefield? What was the best use of tanks in the First World War? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.